Feinberg, and as usual, we're here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and we appreciate all of you being with us right now. Unless you're on our archive, we appreciate that too as well. We're excited today because we're going full circle. Our first virtual book signing, even though it was not this format, it was at the Pritzker Military Library, was with Doris, and so we're happy to get her back again. As I can't believe another book has come by since Team of Rivals, but it is. If you're watching right now and wish to email in a question while we're live for the next hour, please do that, and we'll try to get it on air and have Doris answer it. And if you're watching in the archive, we'll probably have some signed first editions for you to still get while they're still here. What was the run for the first edition?
325,000.
All right, well, those are a little fast. Those are gone already. So we have, while we do, you may want to get that. So, Doris Kearns Goodwin, presidential and political historian, author, political commentator on TV, especially on Meet the Press, a PhD from Harvard in political science, a former assistant to President Lyndon Johnson, author of numerous books, among them No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, The Home Front in World War II, the winner of a Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, which of course was used as the basis of Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln, in which she consulted as well as a historian. She also wrote other bestsellers like Wait Till Next Year, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, and Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. And I've heard she's a Boston Red Sox fan. So, I was at an antiquarian book fair right after the Sox won their, White Sox won their pennant, and the Boston fans were so nice to me and congratulated me. So for Chicago, I want to congratulate the Red Sox.
It was pretty exciting.
I bet.
We were there.
I don't have a photo right here of you on the field with two mascots, but that was an interesting photograph. Next will be a bobblehead. But today, we're here with her latest book, The Bully Pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. Simon & Schuster is the publisher. It's 910 pages and illustrated, and $40. I certainly hope that you're not abandoning our man Lincoln in your affections and going toward TR, but okay, we'll go with it for tonight at least. I also want to say that next Tuesday, why? Because that's when we can do it. We'll have two other books that she had a part of on our website, our virtual book signing website, which you're on right now. We'll have first editions signed, a limited number of them, signed for Team of Rivals, and also first edition copies of the screenplay for the movie Lincoln. There are only 1,000 cloth produced, and signed by both Tony Kushner and the forward, Doris. So we hope that you will snap them up while you can, because they won't be here very long. And we don't have many of them for that matter. You seem to weave love to weave a book with multiple characters in it, and you keep them up in the air so well. So how did Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and the Muckrakers appear as co-stars? How did that happen?
Well, it started just with Teddy Roosevelt. I've always wanted to write about him. I gave a seminar 40 years ago at Harvard on Teddy and the Progressives. But the same with Lincoln, lots of books on, not as many as Lincoln, but with Lincoln I needed to surround him with the Team of Rivals so that it could be hopefully a fresh look into Lincoln. Here too, I started with Teddy, and then I thought, how else can I make this story new? And I started reading about Taft and the fact that I knew, of course, he'd been the president after Teddy. I knew that they'd run against each other in 1912, and I knew he was fat. And I didn't know much else other than that. So then I discovered that there were 400 letters between Teddy and Taft, and that their friendship had started when they were in their early 30s. And I began to look much more deeply into Taft and realized that Teddy had handpicked him, so that when they ruptured in 1912, it was much more emotional than I had understood at first. And then when I tried to figure out why did Taft fail and why was Teddy successful, it became clear that it was Teddy's, I keep calling him Teddy, by the way. I know that historians say he didn't like to be called Teddy, but I think history's won that battle. He's Teddy Roosevelt. So,
but you never said Abe.
No, I never said Abe. I mean, even if I lived with Mr. Lincoln for all those years, I never called him Abe. But In this case, what happened is that what was so great about Roosevelt was that he understood how to be a public leader. He was understanding how he had to do relations with the press in order to produce a pressure from the outside in on a conservative old guard in the Congress that didn't want to pass regulatory legislation to help with the industrial order. And that was the one thing Taft, who had been a judge, and thought when you made a decision it explained itself, you don't have to do anything else, the one thing he couldn't do. So that's what led me to the Muckrakers and to this incredible cast of characters that were at this one magazine, McClure. So on the front is Teddy and Taft, on the back are these other 5 people. So I have surrounded themselves. But in the larger sense, I think when you're trying to define an era, if you could tell different voices in that era, that becomes the texture of the times. Because these are all people who became progressives. Why? And then they all have their own separate backgrounds. And I think by putting them together, you get a broader sense of the era, I hope.
Oh, positively, you did it with Team Revivals, and it works in this book. We had Edmund Morris and Ron Chernow both on here for their Teddy Roosevelt and Washington books, and each confessed that they still use a writing system of index cards and lay them out. How do you go about your research? How do you organize and write the book? And how do you put your characters together?
Well, structure is the hardest thing with a book that has, as you say, people popping in and out at various times. Chronology is, for me, the key to almost everything. So even though the book starts in 1910 when Teddy Roosevelt comes back from Africa and 1 million people wait for him in New York, and then I have Taft going out that same day giving speeches in the rain and having a hard time, I then go back chronologically. So it allows me, even if it's a 7-year project, to continue to do research from day one and not feel that everything is done before I go. So that then what I do is I go to the primary sources as soon as I know enough to know what I want. And that means, as you know, diaries, letters, private journals. That's the treasure of an historian. You feel like you're looking over the shoulder of the person who's writing the letter when you're reading letters. So I always read those first. And then I take notes on them, or they're handwritten, you have to transcribe them. And then I get the newspapers from that period of time. I get other memoirs from that period of time. And then I arrange things in huge chronological notebooks. I probably had maybe 50 notebooks that might cover, their childhood, their college years, and then later meeting their wives. And then when it got to the presidency, it might be every 6 months of his presidency would have its own notebook. And then you have to figure out where do you bring in the other people. And that's the hardest thing to do. And I sort of have this big chalkboard where I figure, okay, this is where McClure's can come in, this is where Taft comes back. And then sometimes I did it wrong and I rearranged it. But that was the funnest and the hardest part. If funnest is a word.
It is nice. There's so much to ask about the book, but I really have some other things I want to get into before we get to the book itself. And maybe harkening back to things that I know that our audience is going to want to hear a little bit about, and that is movies. So we're not going to go a long time on this, but I need to talk about it a little bit. How do you approach a movie being a historian? What was the collaborative effort you had with Spielberg and Kushner? And does writing an historical work differ from making a historical film?
Well, definitely yes to the last question. Although they were so they wanted it to be as historically rooted as possible in the character of Lincoln. That was the most important thing to them and to me. But it was a long process. I mean, Spielberg bought the rights to this book before I was finished with it, the Lincoln book. I'd only written maybe 7 or 8 chapters. He knew that he wanted to make a movie about Lincoln for a long time. And then there were several script writers that worked on it while I'm still finishing the book. And then finally they got Tony Kushner. And once they got him, Spielberg knew he had the man he wanted. And then I saw the drafts, every draft that Tony wrote, talked to Tony, became his friend. And then finally when they got Daniel Day-Lewis, they knew they had the man they wanted to be Lincoln. And Spielberg asked me if I'd take him to Springfield, so I took him for a couple of days. A big burden, of course, to take Daniel Day-Lewis. And he's just a wonderful man. So we went to Lincoln's birthplace, not to the birthplace, to the house where he and Mary lived, to the State House and the law offices. And then I went down to the filming in Richmond and saw the first cut of the movie at Spielberg's house. They really made me, and then went with them to the ceremonies, but they made me a part of it, which they don't have to do. And I think what I loved most about it was that when you write, you're writing alone, and now suddenly you're part of a group, and it was like this traveling troupe, and I really loved it.
Well, I want to ask you about historical truths and creative license. because that did come up. The 3 Oscars that were nominated, the films had controversy. Argo and Zero Dark 30 and the Lincoln film. Steven Spielberg, you and I heard him in Gettysburg last year, and he said, I'm a filmmaker, not an historian. And I think that was a good response and a correct one. Tony Kushner said it's historical fiction. So what is the relationship of reality to art in a movie?
Well, I think what was so important, as I started to say earlier to me, the fact that they chose the story of the 13th Amendment, the story within a story, which I think was a great idea because it allowed you to have something with a beginning, middle, and end, instead of trying to go from 1860 to 1865, when you would have had a breadth of it, but you wouldn't get the depth into Lincoln's character. So to me, the real test for them was this the Lincoln that I thought I knew? The Lincoln you knew, hopefully, where the man who was politically savvy but didn't compromise his principles, the man who told stories. That's the one thing I said to Tony over and again. He has to tell stories. I won't talk to you if he doesn't tell stories, because that was his way, as you know, of whistling off sadness. And I wanted him to tell the particular Ethan Allen story, and he put that in there. And so you saw him as a serious man with a sadness in his face, but you also saw him laughing. And you saw all the aspects of him. That was, to me, if you get the character wrong, I don't care if they change who voted when, or if they decide that somebody did something before somebody else. As Spielberg said at Gettysburg, the filmmaker can fill in the spaces we don't know from history. We don't know what somebody said at some times, right? So if you had to stick to everything they said, then the movie was going to be pretty short. And they used his words when they could, but I thought it was an extraordinary job.
Yeah, it's true. I agree with that. Now, he's taken over this book, and Spielberg, and it's been announced in Variety that it's to be a movie. Have you spoken about the outlines of that movie yet? And is there a screenwriter yet?
No, I mean, it's such an early stage, but what happened is while we were doing the Lincoln movie, we talked a lot. I was with Spielberg a lot, so he knew what I was doing. He asked me to send him the manuscript, because he had read the Lincoln chapters before they were done, too, so there was a special privilege in a way of being there earlier than everyone else. So he read part of the manuscript, then he read the page proofs in the summer, then he finally read the book, and has indeed acquired it. So it's just the beginning of what could be a long journey like the other one, maybe not as long as 10 years, but I'm so thrilled to be able to work with him again.
We've been thinking here in the shop about whom we'd like to see in what role. John Goodman comes up.
Everybody says John Goodman. There's not a lot of people who are going to weigh 350.
That's because James Gandolfini is gone.
He would have been great.
He
Everybody
would be
thought of that. Exactly so.
And I've heard of Philip Seymour Hoffman as Teddy, and Muckrakers will find out.
Yeah.
Whom do you see as a possibility? Anyone different?
Wow.
And will you make a cameo like you tried?
I would love to. Actually, I think I keep teasing that what I really want is for Daniel Day-Lewis to gain 150 pounds. And then he could be either Taft or Teddy. But that's probably not likely. So I leave that choice up to them. He chose brilliantly who every single person. I thought Sally Field was great, and Thaddeus Stevens as Tommy Lee Jones. He knows that far better than I. I keep sticking to the words.
I thought Tommy Lee Jones did a better job than Thaddeus Stevens would have. You speak a lot about many presidents in some of your talks because you've covered many presidents yourself personally and otherwise. What qualities did Lincoln and TR and JFK and LBJ share that made them successful in their presidencies?
I think one of the most important qualities is the ability to withstand adversity and come through trials of fire. They all seem to do that. I mean, think of Lincoln. How many times did he have to get through failure before he finally succeeded? And once you get to be president, if you've done that and you've seen yourself come out the other side, it just gives you perspective. Similarly with Roosevelt, he had suffered asthma when he was a child, and that made him into a serious reader because he couldn't get into the activities of the normal boys' activities until his father finally said to him, "You're becoming an invalid, you're becoming too timid, you must make your body in order to have your mind develop itself." And so he promised, "I'll make my body." He becomes this manic exerciser, right, that we know. And then, however, his beloved father dies when he's a sophomore at Harvard. And then not long after that, he marries this young woman, beautiful young woman, Alice, who dies in childbirth on the same day in the same house as his mother died, having just gotten typhoid fever the week before. He goes to the Badlands, depressed. Constant activity gets him out of it. You know, that's where he gets the love of the open spaces. He comes back and marries his childhood friend, Edith Thoreau, who was probably the perfect wife for him all along. But most importantly, even at 26, he says, I've known sorrow too deep and joy too great to get out of perspective on various elections if I lose them or not. So I think, and FDR's polio made him a different kind of person. They said he was able to identify with people for whom fate had also dealt an unkind hand. And I think that is something in their biography that a lot of these leaders share.
Do they not share some qualities? Are there specific, unique qualities of each that you saw?
Oh, you mean do they have different qualities?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think some
That
of
the
them.
others don't have.
Yeah, no, some of them, for example, I think Roosevelt was able to communicate in a shorthand way, in slogans, in ways that I'm not sure that President Lincoln would have done, because he knew how to poetic language. I'm not sure he would have used phrases like speak softly and carry a big stick, or Maxwell House is good to the very last drop, which Roosevelt did. Nor would he have been sort of as fiery as Roosevelt was, calling people names, but at the time of the Gilded Age, for him to single out the robber barons and call them names, he had a different kind of way of communicating. But President Lincoln's was perfect for his time, because people would read those speeches in full, right? As you know, they'd be pamphletized, and the beauty of the language. By the time Roosevelt comes along, it's newspapers that are printing some of the speech probably, but you're also seeing the headlines and the slogans. By the time FDR comes along, it's the radio. It's that voice that can be conversational on the radio, more important than the written word. By the time JFK comes along, it's television, and that ability to be charismatic on television. So their methods of communication differed over time. Some of them had more emotional intelligence than the others. Some of them surrounded themselves with people, as Lincoln did, and as FDR finally did. They could question them and question their assumptions. So I think they share a lot, but each one is different depending on the era and the problems they're facing.
You've covered all these presidents in books, of course, and I asked this of Tony about loving the object of our study. You mentioned how difficult it was for you to leave Mr. Lincoln and get up every morning without him. You were saddened to have ended the book. Daniel Day-Lewis said, I've never had that depth of love for someone I haven't met. Kushner said there are people who deserve admiration. It's appropriate to fall in love with Lincoln. So how do you keep historical objectivity when you begin to love the object of the study?
Well, I think every president that I've chosen to write about, I have to feel a general liking, respect, and affection for them. I don't want to spend 7 or 10 years with Hitler or Stalin. I couldn't do it. I don't know how people can do it. I give them such credit to wake up with them and think about them when you go to bed at night. So I'm already starting with that objectivity problem. But then every president is still going to do things that disappoint you. I mean, FDR I had enormous respect for, but then wishing that he'd brought more Jewish refugees into the country before Hitler closed the door forever, wishing that he hadn't incarcerated the Japanese Americans. You want to say, come on, don't do this. Or sometimes the way he'd treat Eleanor. My kids who used to tease me, they'd come into the room and hear me saying, Eleanor, just forget the affair he had so many years ago. Or I'd say to him, just be nicer to her. So you still are a historian. Lincoln is the hardest one of all. It's very hard not to love him. I agree with what Tony said and what Daniel said. I care enormously about all these other people, and Teddy's one of the most interesting, colorful, happy characters I've ever read or written about, but nothing will be the same as Lincoln.
Before we leave Lincoln, I just have to ask this too. You compare Lincoln and Roosevelt as able to read public sentiment well and to calculate that popular sentiment. Of course, calculating is one thing and using it is another. What methods did each of those use to shape popular sentiment in brief time?
It's a very interesting question, because obviously Lincoln wasn't traveling the country the same way that Roosevelt was able to on train. Roosevelt would be gone for months at a time, speaking to newspaper editors, speaking at village stations, so he could feel public opinion. Lincoln had it through talking to reporters, but mostly I think he had it instinctively. It's almost like he understood because he was one of them in a certain sense. And then he was able, through his public letters and his speeches, to shape public opinion. Roosevelt had the press that he could talk to all the time, much more so than Lincoln did, because it was the age of the reporter rather than the editorialists. But they both, that is a genius that every great president in a democracy has to have, feeling public sentiment, knowing how to shape it and move it toward the goals you want.
Well, I'd be remiss because of the anniversary coming up in just a couple of days, not to ask you something about JFK. You're married to Richard Goodwin, who, among other things, was a speechwriter for Kennedy. So when I was 16, I was working for Kennedy here as well, and a cousin of mine brought me in to do that, and I, of course, like everyone, remember where I was, 14th of April of 65, and also the 22nd of November of 63, different centuries. So on this 50th anniversary of the assassination, is there some story that you might be able to tell us and share with us about that tragic moment that maybe you or Richard had that you could share with us right now?
You know, the interesting thing my husband said, my husband was obviously in the White House at the time, and he was one of the people who was trying to, because Jackie wanted it to be done this way, recreate the whole circumstances of how Lincoln was laid to rest, because she wanted the same casket, the same understanding of it all. So here in the middle of their turmoil of living with the idea that he'd just been shot, again, like with Teddy Roosevelt, constant activity kept them going that day, going to the Library of Congress, finding old pictures, trying to figure out how to drape the ceiling. I mean, it was an extraordinary detailed thing, which shows how that's how you get through death sometimes. But I think what's interesting now is people are saying there's a revisionist history on JFK because it's not as romanticized as it once was, and that's inevitable because that moment of the assassination, this young, handsome guy getting cut down, led to a romanization. But my husband said he was one time talking to Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby was lamenting that he had only had 3 years, his brother, and it wasn't fair to judge him in history's terms on 3 years. So to make him feel better, Dick said to him, "Well, don't worry, Julius Caesar only had 3 years." But then Bobby looked at me and said, "Yeah, but it helps to have Shakespeare write about you."
Well, let's talk very briefly again about Kennedy's legacy and what your thoughts are on it. I mean, Garfield, let's take James Garfield. He was a popular guy, handsome, a war hero, intelligent, political, and it was a great shock when he was assassinated, although it took a few months for that to happen for his doctors to kill him. But the emotion is gone from that assassination, and no one thinks anything of Garfield today. What's going to happen when all the emotion is drained, when you and I and the others that were there at the time and had Camelot within us, that's all gone? Do you think the legacy will stay?
I think it'll stay longer than you might imagine, only because Kennedy comes into the presidency at the age of television, obviously. So those pictures of him will be forever emblazoned in people's minds. And it's not just Kennedy. Suppose he had been an only child, and that was the end of his presidency. Then it might have shortened the time span, but meanwhile, there's Bobby Kennedy, then there's Teddy Kennedy, and then there's the grandchildren of the Kennedys, and then there's Jackie. So the family, I think, has a place in the history of the country. But I do think you're right, that, 200, 300 years from now, it'll be the accomplishments, the Cold War, possibly the Cuban Missile Crisis, the movement toward peace at the end, introducing the Civil Rights Bill. And there wasn't a lot of time for much more than that. So it won't last the same way it did in popular imagination, I think.
Interestingly, I felt this with Lincoln, that if there's going to be a tricentennial for him, sure, saving the Union, positively slavery gone. But again, that's going to be even further away than we are today. And I keep thinking that if anything's going to keep with Lincoln into the popular culture is his character, whom he was. And we teach who he was to people, how he could organize, how he could write a letter that's pretty difficult and then put it away in a drawer.
Right.
All of these things that made him who he is. I think that's what's going to last to the tricentennial, and maybe the same thing could happen with Kennedy.
I agree with you totally as far as Abraham Lincoln goes. That's that great quote that Tolstoy gives to the newspaper reporter in 1908 when he says, "What made Lincoln so great? He wasn't as great a general as Napoleon," Tolstoy said, "maybe not as great a statesman as Frederick the Great, but his greatness consisted in the integrity of his character and the moral fiber of his being." And that's what young people need to know as time goes by. That won't change. His character is there.
Yeah, we need someone, I think, to look up to these days more than ever, it seems. We have a question that came in, but we've already gone over a little bit of that, how you organize your research notes in more detail, but we have other things we should get to, I think, and I'm sorry to say this, but we do at the moment. No Ordinary Times, an exceptional book. Thank you from a lover of American history. when you give your emails in for questions, please put your name and where you're from so we can give a shout out to you as well. But listen to the beginning, and we did go over a little bit of the organization. Now, there are a number of presidential duos in our nation's history. Jefferson and Adams, who were friends and adversaries and friends again. Truman and Hoover,
Right.
who should be adversaries by their beliefs and temperament, but became friends and colleagues. Roosevelt and Taft. They started as friends and colleagues, then became adversaries. What drove them together in the first place? Certainly civil service reform did. But what drove them together, and how did their characters mesh? And how did their temperaments maybe split them apart?
Well, I think what drew them together, you're suggesting right, is they were both new reformers at a time when the establishment really wanted very little to do with the problems of the industrial age or the corruption in the cities. And civil service, which may seem civil service reform boring to us today, it was a big issue back then because the political bosses had a spoil system and they could corruptly put people into place and business could then give them the money for it. So they both agreed with that. But I think also the opposites of temperament drew them together. I mean, Roosevelt once said of Taft, I envy his personality because everybody loves him at first sight. We know so little about Taft. He was kindly, he was gentle, he had this great smile. He was very good to almost anybody. He could make anybody like him. And Teddy said, it takes longer for people to like me. And then Taft would say of Roosevelt, I love that he prepares so much ahead of time. Taft was a procrastinator. Roosevelt never left anything to the last minute. And then what happens, obviously, is when they're in the presidency together, and he's Secretary of War and Teddy's president, he's the big advisor to Teddy. When Teddy goes on his trips, somebody said to him, what's going to happen when you're gone? And he said, oh, don't worry, I've left Taft sitting on the lid. Then, of course, there's big pictures of big Taft sitting on the lid. So when the rupture comes and they run against each other in 1912, as I say, it becomes a much more emotionally driven event than I had any idea of knowing until I started.
I have, because we can do this, we're going to. Here's an original photograph of,
Oh, how
of him
cool!
in his robes and inscribed. And what is your thought? This is a little bit out of sequence here, but this is what I'm asking right now as we're talking about Taft. What is your thought about him as president versus Supreme Court justice? How was his temperament for one or the other?
Not even a question. He was suited for the court so much more than he was for politics. From the time he was young, he knew it. He knew it the whole time. From the time he was young, all he wanted was to be a judge, and he was a judge. But he married this extraordinary woman, Nellie Heron Taft. She loved politics, and she saw him as a political figure and thought that politics was more expansive than the judiciary. He was offered the chance to be Supreme Court Justice 3 times during Teddy's presidency. Twice he was in the Philippines, and he didn't feel he could leave the Philippines. The 3rd time, he was a potential presidential candidate, and he made the fateful decision, I'll try for the presidency. Never happy being president. The day he is Supreme Court Chief Justice in this role, he said was the happiest day of his life, but it was the last decade of his life. He was deliberative, he was fair, he needed time for he didn't think decisions should be explained once they're given, which is not true when you're a president. So all those qualities made him just right for the court.
How and why did the nation transform itself?
It's one of those mysterious questions about history. I mean, here you have the Gilded Age from the 1880s, the 1900s, into the early 1900s, and you get a combination of things. You get people beginning to see it's not fair what's going on. You've got these millionaires, you've got this gap between the rich and the poor, you've got people in tenement slums, you've got women and children working in factories, you've got private exploitation of all the public lands, and suddenly settlement houses grow. Newspapers start covering these stories. The squalid conditions become known. This magazine is formed, McClure's, which historians claim when they write about the progressive era, it was as important as a vanguard for progressive reform as was Teddy Roosevelt. So you finally get the answer to the Gilded Age in the progressive movement. And it's not only reporters and leaders, it's churches, it's academic life, it spreads through the whole country. I guess it's what FDR later said, some people, some generations have a rendezvous with destiny, and this generation did.
Well, that's interesting. Sam McClure, of course, William Allen White is going to say it's government by magazine.
Right, exactly.
So here we have Sam McClure, who's central to the story. And he went up against the old conservative magazines, Harper's and Atlantic and the Century, and he experimented with new writers, a staff writer system,
Right.
and new technology like photo engraving, which took away from the old wood engravings, which we're used to here in this shop. Tell us about the writers he brought on board. Ida Tarbell, we can't go into all of these, so many great characters here, but Ida Tarbell, Ray Stannard Baker, each of them had presidential biographies under the belt.
Right.
Lincoln Steffens, William Allen White.
They're
How did that
legendary. I mean, they
happen?
still are considered the most brilliant group of reporters ever assembled in one place at one time. I mean, in journalistic history, when you go to journalism school, these are the big guys. And what he did, as you suggest, is he was the first person to understand that you needed to pay these reporters to have time to research. So sometimes they would work for 2 years before even turning in a word. And he gave them generous expense accounts. Eventually the magazine's going to fold because he uses so much money to pay them. But it meant that they could create a story that had facts in it. You could trust what they wrote. And it meant that they then generated a common conversation in the country about Standard Oil or the railroad or the corruptions in the city, and they told stories. McClure said to them, story is the thing. And they knew how to write a narrative story. And so they worked with one another, they had camaraderie, and it was true that without them, and Roosevelt developed extraordinarily close relations with them, he probably wouldn't have reached the people in quite the ways he did.
Well, McClure achieved a power with that magazine, government
Right,
magazine, that's hard to believe today. And the writers were part of it. By the way, before I forget, Ida Tarbell wrote on Lincoln.
Right. I know, it's so great.
What did she,
Well,
what do you think of her?
I love Ida Tarbell. I think her Lincoln gave us interviews with people who might not have been interviewed later because she went around. You know, I remember McClure sends her a note, be sure to get a coat because it may be hard when you're walking around, it might be cold, I don't want anything to happen to you. But here's this woman who, when she is 14, she prays to God that she will never take a husband because she wants to write and she wants to become something. And she saw the frustrations of her mother who had wanted to go on to higher education, had been a teacher, but once her father lost his independent oil company because of the octopus of Standard Oil, she had to stay with the family. So Ida's the only freshman girl at Allegheny College. She becomes this writer, and she worked really hard. I mean, I looked at her books on Lincoln, and she wrote them within months. I mean, but then later she came back to it. But she was able to have rapid writing in a way that I've never learned.
We have a question here, again, we don't know who it's from, a big Theodore Roosevelt fan, but in your research, did you find that a split between TR and Taft was inevitable? We're getting at our story here.
No, that's
They were
okay.
certainly, and we're going to go back and forth
That's
through this
fine.
book. And do you think it was inevitable?
I'm not sure that it was inevitable. I mean, I think if Roosevelt's come back, as he did from Africa, and his progressive friends are telling him that Taft is not as progressive as he thought and hadn't been the leader that he thought, Roosevelt could have decided to wait until 1916. He would have clearly won that election, I think, because Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican candidate, almost beat Woodrow Wilson. And Teddy Roosevelt was 1,000,000 times more popular than Charles Evans Hughes. But somebody said the problem with Roosevelt was he missed being president so much that he couldn't wait. If he hadn't run against Taft, Taft probably would have lost to Wilson. Their friendship wouldn't have broken up, and he could have been president in 1916. So I think it was his yearning to be at the center of things. He always wanted that. I mean, Alice Roosevelt said of him that he wanted to be the bride at the funeral and the corpse the bride at the wedding and the corpse at the funeral and the baby at the baptism. So I keep wishing, or I sometimes wish, what if he come home and says, I really want to be president again, and I know you want to go on the court, and I promise you you'll go on the court. I think Taft would have been happy to not be president again, but he felt the dignity of the office demanded that he protect it by running a second term. Even against Teddy Roosevelt. It was disastrous.
How did investigative journalism assume the proportions of a real movement in the country? I mean, we're skirting it a little bit, but I'd like to...
Well, no, I think what happened is after McClure's became so successful, a 10-cent magazine, that was the key. I mean, Harper's and these other magazines were 35 cents. So it's a literary, much more exclusive circle reading it. McClure's is reaching hundreds of thousands of people. And then other magazines followed suit. So it wasn't just McClure's, but they created the prototype. And then it was a time when the attention span of the country was willing to read long pieces. Some of these pieces by Ida Tarbell or Lincoln Steffens were 20, 30,000 words long, and people gobbled them up. I don't think that would happen today. So that was part of the time as well.
I'm learning about that, and I don't know if I can get to this or not. Yes, I can. It's about today. I was listening to something the other day that eBay founder Pierre Omidyar started a new venture, which is a news startup that will be for general news, investigative news service. He put $250 million into the serious journalism, he says, and he wants to show many views and personalized opinion. It's ironic that the old journalism is being destroyed by new technology, but that's what happens. I mean, I think about the monks. When I feel like a monk sometimes in the movies, because when Gutenberg came by, boom, swept off the face of the earth. So that's happening a little bit with books right now. But he says that today is the golden age of journalism. Well, on the front cover it says this is the golden age of journalism. Is it? Can it be?
Well, it's a really interesting possibility.
Especially with, no one has any staying power, as you say. A tweet, can we do investigative journalism in a tweet?
It might be harder, although some of these forms, like ProPublica, have been able to win Pulitzer Prizes. They took print reporters who were not able to do long pieces because the journalism world wasn't supporting them. And then this money comes in and they can support them doing it, and it still is needed out there. If they're good writers and they have the time and the resources, you gotta believe it'll still somehow get through. So I think it would be great if these people who've made their money in the internet age were willing to subsidize the kind of research and writing that's necessary to create articles that are so well done that they're not going to just be dismissed as partisan one way or the other. They have to be factually based.
And of course, they're buying newspapers. Washington Post is a good example of this.
Right.
But can a Bully Pulpit work today? I guess it can if you use it. Some are not using it today. But FDR and TR, I should say, didn't have instant critics. You have to at least wait for tomorrow's newspaper.
That's exactly
So it's so distorted and eviscerated. Everything you say right now within seconds or while you're speaking. Could the Bully Pulpit
I think it has been diminished. There's no question. It's like everybody else has a Bully Pulpit too, so that you give it to the blogger, you give it to the Facebook people. And so even when you think about President Obama, when he finally gave his healthcare speech, and then that congressman stood up and said, "You lied, Joe Wilson," that became the story. And then the pundits are tearing down the speeches before they've even been finished. And you may be watching your own cable network where you're only going to get an excerpt depending on which partisan side you're on. So it's harder to break through now, but the idea that a president still has an unparalleled platform to educate the country, I think still remains true.
Karen from Marseille, Illinois says, what an amazing interview. We appreciate that. Cannot wait to receive my book and share this with my history class tomorrow. We appreciate your doing that.
Thank you.
Kelly from Chicago asked, if this is the Kelly we think, hello. You're the only historian who has been able to make me cry. You bring emotion into your writing of individuals in history, and it makes your reader feel so close to that person they almost become friend. How do you separate that life from your everyday life, especially for the amount of years you dedicate to write these books?
No, it's a great question. It really is. And I'm not sure you do separate while you're writing it. And I do feel emotion. I mean, as I was reaching the last chapters, knowing that President Lincoln was going to die, I just didn't even want to finish the book because I didn't want it to happen. And even at the end of the Teddy and Taft book, I did not want to end with their rupture in 1912 because it would have been such a sad ending. So I decided to follow the story of the two of them between then and Teddy Roosevelt's death in 1919. And at first people tried to bring them together as allies. Nothing worked. There was kind of like a Cold War between them. But finally in 1918, just a year before Teddy dies, he's in the hospital. Taft writes to him, says he hopes he's going to get better. He had had the same operation he had, and it broke the ice a little. And then what happens, so great to end the book, is that Taft comes to the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago for a conference. He's going up in the elevator, and the guy tells him, "Hey, Mr. Roosevelt's in the dining room eating alone." So he says, "Well, bring me downstairs." He goes into the dining room. There's 100 diners there, and thank God a reporter there who was able to record the scene. He goes over to Roosevelt and says, "I'm so glad to see you." Roosevelt throws his arms around him. They sit down together, and the entire dining room erupts in applause. And then Teddy says, "This is so happy that this happened." 8 months later, Teddy dies in his sleep of an embolism. The Vice President Marshall said he had to die in his sleep because otherwise he would have put up a fight and he'd been away. And Taft is the person at the funeral crying and knowing, as he said to his sister, thank God we got together, I would have mourned it all my life. So of course I get emotional when that happened. I wanted it to happen, and thank God history allowed it to happen. I just didn't want to end with them so sad.
My writing is emotional. I mean, in the middle of Team of Rivals, way back when I was getting ready for you coming in here, I called you and I was in the middle of the book and I said, don't tell me how this ends. It's just so fascinating, you know, and the emotions were there, don't tell me. And I didn't want it to end either. I slowed down, slow reading already. Going back into a couple of things just for a second, Sam McClure again, some dalliances, or a dalliance, that messed up the staff writers to some extent in the magazine.
Yeah, what happened is sad. I mean, he was a kind of a manic depressive, I think. If we looked at him now, that's what we'd say he was. And he'd had a very difficult childhood. Anyway, he would go to sanitariums when he got depressed, where they thought the cure for depression then was milk. You would have milk for 3 weeks and nothing else. They thought the milk would replace the bad blood. So obviously he never got better from those things. But in his manic phases, he did have an affair with a young woman. And the problem the other writers felt was not that they were being prudish about it, but he exchanged letters with her. And they knew if those letters ever got into the hands of the people who were being exposed by the magazine, the business guys, the Standard Oil guys, the railroad guys, then they would use them and say how hypocritical McClure's was. So they finally broke from Sam McClure, much to their sadness, formed their own magazine, and it really destroyed him in some ways, even though he destroyed himself. And then much, much later, when he turns in their 80s, and they're all in their 80s and almost 90s, they get together on his birthday, though, to celebrate the memory of this time. And they all look back on it and say it was the happiest time of their life because they felt they had a mission and a call.
I am showing one of the volumes, first volume of the limited edition of African Game Trails, which really starts your book and is a part of it. Here is Teddy Roosevelt's signature in it, and this is a limited edition. It's a beautiful piece and doesn't come by, especially in this condition, very often. So, how was he as a writer? What's your
No, it's
thought?
so interesting about Roosevelt. What he says is that he's an ordinary man who developed extraordinary qualities by perseverance. So that he slaved over his writing. He knew he was never a writer of genius, but he produced distinguished work, and particularly when he's writing about wildlife or writing about nature, he's quite poetic. So those are his best books. I really think they are, including this one. And there was a sense in which also he said, I wasn't a good shot, but I became a wild game hunter because I worked at it. I didn't have great eyesight, but I became a world-class birder. And as I say, he wrote 40 books, but this is among the distinguished ones. So he's a great example. Just like you say, character can be the exemplar of Lincoln. He's an example of somebody who worked hard at everything he did. If he had a speech to give, he'd prepare it a year ahead of time before
He comes back from hunting trip. He's not president any longer. His hand-picked guy is Taft, and he's not happy with what he sees when he comes back.
Well, the extraordinary thing that happens to him when he comes back, 1 million people are on the streets of New York to welcome him. There's teddy bears all over the place. You, of course, know the teddy bear was named after him, and the greatest toy of all time. You know, that's how there was this feeling about him. The story was that he went on a hunting expedition, and he didn't catch a bear, and the organizers felt bad. So they actually brought a bear for him to shoot, and he refused. And then the cartoons made the bear smaller and smaller and smaller, making him look even greater for not shooting it. And of course, that became the teddy bear. So anyway, teddy bears are hanging in the doorways in New York when he comes back home. And again, I think he felt, wow, this feels pretty great to be back in the middle of all of this. And then he starts talking to his progressive friends, especially the conservation guy, Gifford Pinchot, who had a big fight with Taft's Secretary of the Interior. And he begins to think that Taft hasn't done what he hoped he would. What has really happened, I think, is that Teddy has moved further to the left. They were aligned when they were both in the presidency, in the cabinet at the same time. And Taft has probably stayed where he was. So the movement's passed him by. It's not that he turned conservative, but that he just stayed where he was and the movement went further. And so then he makes the decision to run against him, put his hat in the ring, and the campaign becomes really bad. I mean, he just calls Taft things that I know he doesn't believe. he'll say he has the brain of a guinea pig, which is ridiculous. He knew that Taft was very smart. He was second in his class at Yale.
What happens if TRD did this?
I think Taft said about him, and I think he's right, that when he needed to deal with an adversary, he had to make him an enemy. And that would allow him to go out and fight. And also, he really did believe that the country had to move in much, he was for women's suffrage by that time. He was for a lot of things that were bigger than where he had been before. And then Taft, I think, feeling so hurt by Teddy, finally responds back and says if he wins a third term, he'll want a fourth, he'll want a fifth, and dictatorship will take the place of democracy. So that's why when they finally get together, it was a really bad campaign. I mean, the way they talked about each other makes the current Republican Civil War seem mild.
Of course, we're just going over these very briefly. There's so much in this book that is in depth that will give us even greater understanding than you're giving us right now. The Progressive Party convention happened right here in Chicago. I happened to, strangely enough, going through some of my things the other day. Here's a ticket to get in. So if the 1912 convention comes by again, you're in.
Excellent.
Sure.
Isn't that cool? See, look at the pictures on it too.
Yeah.
Isn't Lincoln there?
Lincoln, Washington, and Jefferson.
Wow.
You can see this a little later on.
Yeah.
Now I'll show you again. Now Jane Addams, our own Jane Addams, the first woman to go up and nominate
Right.
a presidential candidate.
Right.
She came in and did that. And you described the convention, you're right that it sounded like a Eugene McCarthy or Barack Obama convention. Quote, not a saloon keeper in the crowd, unquote. So the 1912 presidential election comes by, and it was really a three-way dance between Roosevelt, Wilson, and Wisconsin's Lafayette. So it was a field crowded with progressives, including, for that matter, Taft.
Right. At that time, right. I mean, he's not as conservative as we now think about it.
Exactly. And you said you bring that out. And I think
At least he
that's an
believed
excellent-
in the role of government, that government needed to help people who needed to deal with these social problems from the industrial age.
You know, at the time he had to be a little different than the rest.
Yes, I think what happened is he said, in fact, in a letter, that now he's got, first of all, the socialist Eugene Debs is out there too, and he wins almost 1 million votes. So the country has really moved in that direction. So he said, all that's left for me is to represent the conservatives. And he really did believe it. He believed that what the progressives were saying about the Republican Party wasn't fair. He would say in his speeches, we are the party of Lincoln. We can still be proud of who we are. And I am for these things. But what happened is that Roosevelt made a proposal in the campaign that he was mad at the courts because they kept undoing a lot of the legislation that was being passed. So he called for judicial recall, which meant that if you didn't like not a Supreme Court, but a state court decision, the popular people could recall the decision, which went really far. In fact, even his closest friends, Henry Cabot Lodge, thought he'd gone off the rails. And Taft, who loves the judiciary so much, thought he was undoing the separation of powers. So that was a real argument they had between them.
How did the muckrakers split in this campaign? They split.
Yes.
Certainly, for instance, this is more than that, that TR thought that maybe Taft had betrayed him. And there were, here is the New York World, June 16th, 1912, coming up with 100 reasons why Roosevelt should not be president.
Yeah.
Whereas Gifford Pinchot, the American forestry head, only came up with 16 betrayals. Nonetheless, here are 16.
I have to read that. I can't read
I
that.
wonder if any of these are cogent.
I suspect some of them might have been, like, for example, when Taft came into office, Teddy had taken a lot of executive actions to take lands away from private developers to save them for the public. He couldn't get laws passed, so he decided, I'll do it with executive actions. When Taft comes in as a legal person, he wants to pass laws to take these lands away. And in the interim, there's a feeling that they're letting a lot of these business guys take the lands. So that's where the argument goes between Pinchot and Taft. Eventually, he gets the laws passed, and the lands are still preserved, but he lost the public battle in the meantime.
So many things I have to ask you, actually. I'm going to go to the end here. Because there are a couple of things that
You should have different color papers.
I know, it's true. I want to ask you about letter writing in history, because we're talking about that in the manuscript world. And letter writing is And I've been doing cursive anymore, for that matter. So how will that affect historians in the future? Will emails and tweets fill that void? You're saying a bit, perhaps.
Yeah, only in the sense that at least emails and tweets are written down. The period when people talked on the phone is lost forever in history, right? When that was the main means of communication, except for, like President Johnson, who recorded his phone calls, or President Nixon, who taped things. But other than that, but still, you know what the staccato quality of emails are. People aren't really intimately talking the way you did when the only means of communication back in Lincoln's time, or even in early Teddy and Taft time, are letters when people are away. You're emotionally talking to those people because you have no other way of doing it. And as a historian, you feel like you're looking over their shoulders as they write a handwritten letter. I don't think anything will replace that. I think 200 years from now, we'll know much more about the people now. We'll see how they walk. Like in the Lincoln movie, we only have to rely on the fact that a partner of Lincoln said he walked like a laborer coming home at the end of a hard day. We knew he had a high-pitched voice. We never listened to it because somebody said that. So now we'll be able to see in 3D are people walking, talking, or hear their voices. But will we have the intimate relationships that you can discern from a handwritten letter or a diary written at the end? People don't keep diaries anymore in the same way. So I think it's going to be much harder to get at the connections between people, even though we'll be surfeited with material. We'll have so much stuff, it'll be hard to sort it out.
Well, that's not a good thing. Is there anything you found in these two characters, especially in Taft and TR, that surprised you, that you didn't expect to see, or something that disturbed you?
Well, I think, with Taft, there's no question that I had no idea how much a part of the Roosevelt administration he was and how much more of a figure he was. And it just shows that if you can't in a democracy put your mark on your time, then it's hard to, he had a lot of substantial accomplishments even, but he didn't trumpet them and no one else was going to trumpet them. So I think I felt kindlier toward Taft. I really didn't have any feelings toward him before, one way or the other. And with Teddy, I think what I've always felt about him are two things. Domestically, I have great respect for what he did. I think he really deserves credit for having brought the presidency into the modern era, for having made government an important piece of reining in private power. His attitudes toward war, I still have a difficult time accepting. When he'll say things like, the victories of war are greater by far than the victories of peace. And he romanticized being in battle. And I have a son who joined the Army right after September 11th, who wrote his honors thesis at Harvard on Teddy Roosevelt, and really liked him very much. And then he had graduated from Harvard that June. He joined the Army after September 11th, and he was a platoon leader in Baghdad, and then he was called back to Afghanistan, got a Bronze Star. And he said to me afterwards, after having been in combat, how could Roosevelt ever have romanticized it? It's such a terribly hard thing. So that, when I hadn't thought about the whole Teddy Roosevelt war thing, and luckily I'm not writing much about his foreign policy. And actually he was pretty peaceful as a president once the Philippines thing was over. But his attitudes really are so, I think they're nuts.
Yeah, different time too.
Yeah, different time.
You touched on Edith Roosevelt, and Taft also had an impressive woman, Nellie, in his life. Briefly tell us about her.
Well, the thing about Nellie that was so interesting, even as an adolescent, she was unconventional. She loved going to the beer halls in Cincinnati where the laborers were. She was desiring, she said in her diary, I'm blue as indigo. I want to do something in my life, and they just want me to go into society. And so she resisted that, and she wanted to trade her party dresses for piano lessons because she loved classical music. She becomes a teacher, and then I think what happens is she finds perhaps one of the few men at the time who was allowing her to become what she wanted to become, and who had a sense of her intelligence and her independence. Somebody said to me once, if you had to be a woman in that time period, knowing that Edith Roosevelt simply wanted to be the wife and mother and had no public ambitions beyond that, or Nellie, who had these public ambitions, and even as First Lady, she did a lot of things for working women. She brought the cherry trees to Washington. She brought a much wider guest list to the White House. She created a public park for free concerts. They said, which one would you rather be? And I know if I married Taft, I would have had the chance maybe to be a writer and do my own thing, more so than with Teddy. but I think I probably would have chosen Teddy.
Yeah. A question came in from David in Indiana. Is there an American president who has yet to have a definitive biography written about him?
It's a great question. In fact, it was brought up
Miller
in the New
Fillmore.
York Times. Miller Fillmore. His name makes you want to write about him, right?
Ray Back did it.
Yeah, no, I think the interesting thing that was in the New York Times on the anniversary of JFK's death, the writer said she wasn't sure there was a definitive biography of JFK. I'm not sure that's true, but there's something to what she says
It's
that's
too
right.
early for that?
Maybe it is too early. I couldn't write about anybody unless they're way back in time because I need those materials. So I think even JFK is too modern for me.
You talked in the book about Roosevelt and how he liked to have the journalists come in and speak with him while he was shaving.
Right.
Is this the same as LBJ sitting in the bathroom while journalists come through?
I hadn't thought about that, but I mean, LBJ's strange habit of not wanting to stop a conversation when you're in the middle of it. So if you're talking to him, you're supposed to go in and follow him to the bathroom. I suspect no other president quite did that.
Yeah.
But in Roosevelt's case, he's being shaved by a straight-edge razor, and the barber is having to follow him as he's turning to talk to the journalist, and he's gesticulating all over the place. They said the barber had to be very, very acute in what he was doing.
Doris, I'm going to put you to work for a few moments
I
here,
will gladly do this.
for some of our people while I tell people we appreciate their support of the program and of our shop and making sure that publishers bring in great historians like
To
Doris.
some extent, those people who are in the Republican Party are admiring his personality and his verve and his energy and his character, even though they would disagree, even then, I think, with the amount of government that he brought into being to help with the problems. So, but I'm sure some of them, even now, are probably splitting off from him in a way they wouldn't have before because they've become more conservative, even than the Republican Party was 20 years ago.
Do you think that, gerrymandering is maybe one problem, not all the problem, but certainly a major one. California is trying a new initiative, having a commission that's nonpartisan and certain type of primaries. Do you think that can be reversed a bit?
It's got to be. I mean, the fact that we have these gerrymandered districts where people don't have to care what the country thinks, but only what their district thinks, makes you not willing to compromise or to moderate your points of view. I think campaign finance is the poison in the system, too. Unless we get money less important in this political system, do we need a constitutional amendment? Maybe we do. I'm not sure. But those combinations of things, and the media that's so divisive now, and the fact that they don't stay in Washington on the weekends like they used to play poker and drink together before they were going down home every weekend to raise funds. There's about 5 or 6 things that have to come together to change it, but there's at least enough push now from people. And maybe states will become the experimental places again, as they were in the progressive era. Before the national legislation, states had tried out a lot of these things, and that's the way it often works.
Well, Roosevelt used a direct primary system, didn't he? And to his advantage, actually. And did that primary system kill off the convention a bit? I mean, I used to love waiting up all night and smoking cigars to be a part of them. And the convention system is not what it was.
No question. I mean, when Roosevelt decided to run for the presidency, he knew his only chance was the primary because Taft had control of the conventions in the various states and had the party behind him. So that's where the direct primary really got going. And in the states where there was a direct primary, Teddy won almost all those votes. But Taft still had the conventions. But then what happens, interestingly, after 12, the conventions come back again for a period of time because of the war, World War I, World War II. The primary system fell away again until the 50s, 60s, 70s. Now it's become huge. And it's true, it has sapped the meaning of conventions. For those of us political junkies, it was so much fun to not know who was going to win.
And I don't think we have it's more personality, it seems to me,
I
and
think
not
that's right.
the party view.
Right,
Whatever that's going to
right.
be, the party view coming across. I think that's something we've lost.
I think you're right. And maybe those old party leaders, in deciding who should be the candidate, knew more than we do, who are just watching ads on television and deciding who should be the candidate.
Yeah,
So,
strangely enough.
yes, I mean, you look at, okay, Lincoln comes from a convention system, FDR comes from a convention system, Teddy originally did. So it's an interesting thing. We thought the direct primary was a great innovation. Maybe it isn't.
It isn't. In the audience, Jerry, please speak up so we can hear you.
Without suggesting that Comedy Central is equal to Sam McClure. What do you think about the mantle of the muckrakers now falling on people like Jon Stewart and maybe even Rachel Maddow might be more serious?
I think to some extent it is true that, especially for the younger generation, Colbert and Jon Stewart are their main source of getting news. And at least they care about the news because of these people. They're such smart people. I mean, I've been on both Colbert and Stewart, and I like them both very much. And I think injecting humor into our understanding of politics, and sometimes they really do expose what goes on that's hypocritical. In fact, often they do. And I think it's a service for us. What it still needs is that sustained effort out there to keep people involved in a particular issue. And they are subject, like everybody else is, to having to move from one thing to another as each night goes by. And so I think it's a glimmer, though, of excitement about politics that without which I wonder what would happen to the younger generation. They can't be looking at our public leaders in Washington and say, oh, I can't wait to be one of them. But after watching Stewart and Colbert, they at least care. They know about the issues of the day. So I think it's a very helpful thing, actually.
Are politicians reflecting who we are as a nation, as people? I mean, are we getting what we deserve?
That's a good question, because one of the things Sam McClure says is, in the end, there's no one left but all of us. So if we're frustrated with what's going on in Washington, and everybody seems to be, if we feel like it's, that the situation has become paralyzed, then what are we going to do about it? I mean, we're the ones that put these people there, and we can take them away. I mean, there are polls that show 80% or whatever it was, want to get rid of their congressman. But I bet when they go to vote, it'll be the same people back there again.
Maybe this is the wrong time to ask this. Probably haven't started on a book tour for heaven's sakes here, so with TR. Do you have any glimmer of the next?
Well, one of the things I'm thinking about is bringing all my guys together and writing about leadership. So it has to do with the questions you asked earlier. Are there certain traits that they share? How do they differ? Then I wouldn't be doing research on the new president, but I would be able to think about Franklin, even Eleanor, and Teddy, and Taft, and Lincoln, and LBJ, who was a half fabulous president, half difficult on Vietnam. So I think that might be fun, and I think about leadership a lot in each one of these books. So there's things that connect them all to each other, and then I'll have them all in the room at the same time.
Yeah.